like to call to order this session of the Tacoma Park City Council. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Stewart.
Here.
Councilmember DeBala.
Here.
Councilmember Kostick.
Here.
Councilmember Stevens.
Present.
Councilmember Kovar.
Here.
Councilmember Smith.
Here.
Councilmember Searcy. I think she's here.
She's muted. Now she's free.
Councilmember Searcy.
She just turned her mute.
What is happening? I was like, I muted myself, then someone muted me back. No, I'm here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Tonight is a budget work session. I just want to take this opportunity to make sure people know about the dates coming up for us. As everyone I think knows, we started our budget process a while ago, but most formally on April 6th when the city manager presented the proposed budget. What we have left is our work session this evening. And then on Wednesday, April 29th, we have a public hearing on the budget and the tax rate. You can sign up to speak during the public hearing on the city website. And that evening, we will also continue our conversation about the budget reconciliation list. Then on Monday, May 4th, we will have our final session on the budget reconciliation. We want to make sure that the public has an opportunity to weigh in and present their opinions on that. So unlike years prior, we're actually going to hold a pre-session from 5 to 6:30 on Monday, May 4th, so that people can come ask questions and provide public comment. So sign up for that will be available before the meeting as well. And more information on how that will work is on the city website. And then we have our first vote scheduled on the budget on May 13th and the second vote on May 20th. So that is our budget schedule to come up in the next couple of weeks. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our city manager to walk through the departmental budgets and personnel tonight.
Thank you very much. In scheduling the items to be covered by the work sessions, I scheduled this item last, which has to do with departmental work programs and personnel. With the pandemic, I wanted to have as much time as possible to see what I could learn about the impacts of the pandemic on our workforce and on the economy and on our finances. I know a lot more than I did on April 6th, but there's lots to still learn over the months ahead. I do know more than I did even yesterday when I had another conversation with COG CAO personnel about what does recovery look like and what will it require of government. I'd like to go through the budget information tonight about departments. It's primarily on a departmental basis, identifying what was originally proposed in the proposed budget and any impacts or changes that have to do with the pandemic so that the council can think about that in making reconciliation items. And let's see if I can share. Let's see. Is that showing up?
No.
Okay. I didn't get to the right place here. Let's see.
There you
There you
go.
go.
It's up?
Yep.
Okay, there we go. So we've had the presentation and a budget work session on the important work that we're doing helping residents, property owners, and business owners, public hearing on the budget, and a budget work session on the capital program. This is the budget work session on departmental and personnel and non-departmental items. So as I've mentioned each time, the proposed budget was mostly prepared before the COVID-19 emergency as a maintenance of effort budget. So there weren't any new programs or initiatives in that item. In this budget, one new IT position is proposed, as well as some part-time hours. There's a variety of things that the part-time hours go to. The only new responsibility was a proposal to have before school care at the rec center based on the request by residents in Ward 6 around the rec center. As you'll see, the COVID-19 pandemic has made many changes with staff assignments since March 13th when the governor's emergency order went into effect. It's likely to affect staffing. It affects it now, it'll affect it in FY21, and the funding will be affected in FY22. So we've been going through this. On May 4th, you'll be considering the reconciliation items. As you know, I took a number of steps immediately with the pandemic to give some flexibility to the council on making some of these economic decisions. Union negotiations were paused, staff wage increases were put on hold, a number of capital projects were postponed, public arts projects were postponed, and we've been scouring funds to assist the mini grants and emergency services grants that we have. Still, some budget numbers and impacts aren't known, but we are following best practices about how to handle financial issues in a difficult time. And we maintain our work to uphold and fulfill the goals of the council. So our maintenance of effort budget did have no new projects or priorities, but it did have an emphasis on the implementation of the Housing and Economic Development Strategic Plan and the Climate Change Response Resolution. We had some intern positions that had not been in FY20 proposed for FY21. Interns are at a relatively low cost, a great way to get professional assistance. We also were going to be restoring some conference and training budgets that had been cut for FY20. Just under 2 FTEs are proposed to be added in this budget, the most important of which is a new IT position. It's a critically needed position. It will help address staff IT needs while freeing up the other 3 IT staff to manage the system and to work to enhance system security. I don't know how many different residents have sent me links to stories about ransomware and threats to governmental financial systems. It is something that's widespread. It is something that takes a lot of time for us to ensure that our systems that handle our financial programs, our police security programs are kept safe. The IT office has been using a part-time intern, and the intern is not proposed for FY21. There's a variety of part-time hours in the remaining 0.98 FTE. One's not on this list here. Most of them are rec staff positions for school care. There's some hours that also are affected in public works, as you'll see, and some in police with the crossing guard changes. So they're small amounts for the most part. The rec center hours would be, the cost of that staff would be offset by the revenue from that program. But we've had a lot of changes since the COVID-19 pandemic hit this region. And so on March 13th, our emergency order meant that we went to work remotely for most staff, and we suspended in-person services. We have some mixture of savings from postponing personnel hiring, not attending conferences. Police department staff have not had to spend as much time in overtime because they often do use overtime to attend court, and courts are closed. We have some issue with, there's also been some savings with some of the recreation programs, but the more expensive aspect is that there's not a spring break camp. So the revenue for that is not being accepted, and we're continuing to pay for this fiscal year the part-time staff that would have provided the after-school and summer camp programs. We've, when we go through the various items that we've either saved or put out because of COVID-19, we have a net result, we project a net result savings of approximately $171,000. Right now, hazard pay of varying levels is being paid to police officers assigned to patrol, public works staff collecting sanitation or doing cleaning, and dispatch staff working in a small room. And there's several other public works staff who are subject to exposure to COVID-19 due to work more than other folks. And so we have agreed to, I've issued an order to pay some hazard pay. That hazard pay is, can be suspended at any time and may be adjusted. We don't know how long the pandemic closures will last, and we don't know what new assignments city staff will be called upon to perform. One of the areas that, and I've mentioned this before, one of the areas that we're particularly watching is what role the recreation department staff may be required to do if there's a need to perform childcare or do, or the children go back to school and we have before and after care. If the idea is that people need to work and go back to work, then often they need to have their kids watched. But that's a, that has a higher level of risk. And so there may be training, protective measures, and extra staff costs related to that. We also know that many residents and business owners may need additional assistance. We already have seen the concerns about food and rent and keeping a business going during this time. There are many people trying to help, but there are a lot of people are looking to the city, and whether or not we are able to help is a good question moving forward. One of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic is that our health insurance company for staff wants to raise rates, and it will be higher than the amount that was assumed in the FY21 proposed budget. We don't know exactly what it will be yet. They don't have to give us an actual price until June 1st. We also will make a determination about how long we pay hazard pay and how much that is. If the hazard pay is continued for a year, we're talking $500,000, which is 2 cents on the tax rate. Some savings can be accommodated by not filling some positions. There's some positions that aren't needed or some activities that we cannot do. And so those are savings that we have been going through, scrubbing the budget to determine what makes a good recommendation for the city. We're also looking at the decline in revenue from recreation department fees and from a number of cities' revenues. And the combined loss of revenue with the offset of some of the recreation department staffing savings in the future would be about $389,000 in FY21. The loss of revenue in FY22 could be much greater, particularly related to income tax revenue. We don't have a projection on that. We don't know what might happen with federal funds for residents and what kind of income support there is. We also don't know what the federal impact will be of any assistance to state and local governments on revenue that we're not getting. And this is an issue across the country. So as we go through the various, we're going through as if we're going through the budget document by department. The first category is the general management section of the budget, legislative and legal. Legislative is the city council. So I'm going to try to go through these relatively quickly. When I get to certain departments, I'll turn it to the department head to identify. But for legislative, on the city council, I'm comparing numbers on this from the adopted FY20 to the proposed FY21. Because first of all, there were a lot of vacancies for the estimated FY20 numbers, and there's been adjustments even with the pandemic. So we're trying to compare equal numbers, at least for context. I've used the adopted FY20 number versus the proposed FY21 number. For the City Council, the adopted number was 211,000, with a proposed for FY21 of 370,000. This includes funds for additional funds for the salary and benefits for the incoming council. And this is an undercount. I believe it's $117,000 extra. And we did get a late correction on that. The work plan for the City Council, besides doing the other activities of the council, this coming year will be to recruit for a new city manager and hire that person. And so that's something that will take place once the new council comes into office. Also proposed for the work plan for the City Council is to have a 6-month intern to assist with the elections. The intern will be needed whether the election is done at a polling place or by mail. When we look at pandemic implications, there aren't any specific ones. Council may wish to make adjustments in the budget, which had included an extra amount of money for compensation, anticipating the compensation committee's recommendation. And it may be more challenging to recruit a new city manager during the pandemic, and we'll see what that might mean. The legal budget's very straightforward, and it's legal services on an hourly basis. There's no change with the pandemic, although all activities of the city attorney that are COVID-19 related are being kept separately, accumulated separately for possible reimbursement. So the general management division of the general management section is the city manager's office. The number for the adopted FY20 was 667,000, the proposed 738,000. The major difference in this section is the $600,000 resident survey and an additional $20,000 in contract costs, which could be to go along with the resident survey or for some other contract that's been unspecified. In this unit, our executive assistant had moved to HCD. There's a desire to have an assistant to the manager position, which actually saves a little bit in wages. There is actually right now, MML has a fellowship position that may be something that we can use at no charge for a couple months. So we'll look into that. My primary work plan in the coming year is to ready the city government for a new city manager. The pandemic implications are that we have to manage a city through a pandemic and make all the adjustments that are needed in staffing and management of reimbursement requests and that kind of thing. I would like to note that there wouldn't be any change in the role necessarily of an assistant to the manager position, but the role of this assistant to the manager position is critical for many of the things that the council and I have wanted for some time. Somebody who would be helpful in writing testimony, assisting with the race equity oversight efforts, providing assistance on council inquiries and concerns. And of course, the person could work during the pandemic. Now we come to the finance division. We have the fortune of having an excellent finance director, Susan Chung, who is a CPA and has won numerous awards from the Government Finance Officers Association for excellence in budgeting and in financial reporting. Susan, are you available to talk a moment about the finance division? Let's see if she's there.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, good. Perhaps you can just mention a little bit about the FY21 plan for the finance division.
Yes. Good evening. I'm Susan Chung, the finance director in City of Tacoma Park. I just want to talk about what we are planning for FY21. The major change is about a position that we have increase. It's not an increase of position, but it's an upgrade of a position from a budget specialist position to a budget manager's position. And that is like being consistent with our succession planning, that we have someone to back up the office when maybe I'm away or I'm not available due to sickness. And in the finance department, there are no major change in the type of work that we're doing, but mainly the most increase is in the contractual side that we are paying for the auditors, the financial processing, and also the other financial work. So the contractual piece and also the conferences is the other part that I want to mention that may increase because I have some new staff here and I want to provide them with opportunity for more training. So I would say those are the two areas that have a little bit higher cost compared to FY20. And about the pandemic implications, I want to mention that my staff have been working very hard during these past few weeks, especially by helping out to issue those small business mini grant checks. And we actually sent out 13 checks to the mini grantees last week, and the total is $27,500. And this week we are planning to send out another 9 checks for the mini grantees. So I'm very grateful that my staff are working so hard to help out during this uncertain period of time. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Our Information Systems Division is the only division that has a proposal for a new full-time position. But there would not be an intern in this division. In my view, this is the most important new position position that's vacant to be filled in the city. We really need assistance with the IT security. And Lars DeSalvo, are you available to speak just a moment to the IT division?
Yes. The IT division, we run with 3 full-time staff and an intern right now. And with this additional person as a full-time person and not having an intern would give us the capability to more focus certain employees' time and talents in areas around security. This past year, there have been a lot of ransomware attacks, but in addition, there have been a lot of phishing incidents. We had one spear phishing incident where we almost, we could have had a wire transfer made out from the city. And, you know, it was pretty serious. The people did their homework in that incident. And, you know, it was quite impressive. And we were quite honestly lucky that that didn't go out. So we're fighting these security incidents every day. We do quarterly checks on staff email accounts. Basically, every email account in Tacoma Park dating back 10 plus years is on the dark web, been sold multiple times. Even our new staff who have only been in the organization for a few months. So that information is getting harvested and used. We also had 2 attacks on the police department's internal affairs system just a couple months ago. So we're dealing with these things every day, and it's not going away. It just gets worse, you know, every year that goes by. So
could you speak also a little bit to what's been happening during the pandemic?
During the pandemic, we've had at least a doubling in our support requests, supporting people who are working remotely, as well as the hardware, because we're increasing the amount of units that we need to keep up with security patches, software patches, monitoring. We get notifications of security incidents, you know, somebody attempting to get into a person's email from Ohio, you know, well, then you got to find out where the people are working from. So, you know, it takes time. And so far, I think we're doing a very good job with the limited staff that we have, but we do need more It's never ending.
Thank you. And I will say that IT has been great during the pandemic. They also have been helping on these virtual council meetings and in other ways that we've been supporting our department. So kudos to the division. It's been really remarkably good. Next, we have the Human Resources Division. Tracy Smith, would you like to speak a moment to the division budget?
Absolutely. So Human Resources Division also runs on 3 full-time employees and 1 intern. For the first time in almost a year, we're fully staffed as of March 1st. We're generally just keeping on with the policies and procedures and things that we were doing before through Human Resources. The new thing that we are doing with the pandemic is making the changes to the payroll system and Tyler system in order to track all the COVID-related payroll information in order to be able to secure it on the system as well as track it on a spreadsheet as well. The big thing, the big new change for the budget next year, as was said before, is the recruiting of the city manager position, which there are some additional funds for, which may or may not be extremely challenging, depending on how this shapes up. Otherwise, we're just status quo.
Thank you. Now we have the City Clerk Division. Jesse, would you like to speak to that?
There really isn't much to say. It's business as usual, but we're planning for an election. Exactly what kind of election, we don't know yet. We're waiting to find out what the state of Maryland will be doing. And we're pretty much business as usual. We were just on the verge of starting the record specialist, bringing people in for interviews, and we were confronted with the pandemic. So we are, that is now on hold again. Happy to take any questions when the time comes.
Thank you. And I think part of the difference in this budget is the elections for this year. Now we have the Police Department, and Chief Duvall, would you like to speak a moment to the Police Department's budget?
Absolutely. Before the pandemic started, I think a week before we got into the shelter in place and so on and so forth, I was proud to announce that we are fully staffed, and that's when all of our sworn positions and all of our civilian positions. So we're happy about that. Same service budget. We didn't ask for any additional positions. As you can imagine, what we're dealing with now is dealing with the pandemic and how we respond, our response protocol, making sure our officers and staff are ready, setting up our civilian staff for telecommuting. It's something that we're trying to adapt to and trying to figure out how long we can maintain. As the city manager alluded to earlier, there's been hazard pay for our police officers and some hazard pay for our communication staff as well. Kudos to all of our staff for doing a phenomenal job. The one thing we really think is important is the personal nature of our police department and having a police department in a small municipality. The stay-at-home orders and the social distancing makes that a little bit more difficult, but we're striving to make sure that we continue to provide the quality service that we provide to our residents. Like I say, really nothing new budget-wise. It's the same service budget. We're not asking for any new positions, but I just am really, really proud that we were able to hire some quality people, both sworn and civilian, and I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end.
Thank you. I would like to note that although the budget is listed here as $8 or $9 million, about $3 million of that is offset by monies from the county and the state. Public Works Department. Daryl Braithwaite, could you speak to the Public Works Department budget? No, Daryl was there.
There, how about now?
There you go.
Sorry about that. As Susie mentioned, our budget is primarily a continuation of services. No significant staffing or budget changes. We are proposing a deputy director position, which is a position we haven't had for many, many years. In the past, that position was eliminated and reprogrammed for a construction manager and a special projects person. Now we're taking a look at succession planning and want to propose that deputy position to help with the administrative functions in the department. The current position that is vacated is the special projects coordinator, which was 0.6 full-time equivalent in the Public Works operating budget, and the remainder of that was in the stormwater budget. So as we transition to that position, we'll actually increase by 0.4 the FTEs in the Public Works operating budget, but we'll have a reduction of the 0.4 in the stormwater budget, so slightly less salary requirements in this coming out of stormwater budget. We have a number of positions that are currently vacant. We have vegetation manager position, which is trying to create a new combination of staff in the department to oversee not just gardens, which is what it previously was, but to combine the turf management and the gardens and kind of have some collaboration between the staff there so we can fill in more of the work on a shared basis. We also now have a vacant arborist position. We're currently filling that with consulting contractor, and although we have the advertisement for the urban forest manager position, we're still at this point waiting to see what happens in terms of the budgeting. That is a position that's really critical for the department in terms of the interface with the public, and anything that is required falls on other staff to fill in the gaps. So it's one that we're really anxious to get filled again. It's in some ways seasonal, but there's always a very consistent workload. In terms of pandemic implications, as you may know, most of my staff is currently working from the office. So we have our sanitation divisions, our vehicle maintenance division, our building maintenance division, our right-of-way division, all on board every day coming to work. And we do really recognize and appreciate all the efforts that they're putting in. And I think in this strange time, it helps things feel a bit normal. The only positions that are not currently working from the office are our sustainability manager and our city engineer, as well as our admin staff person. We've got somebody filling in for them. So we're continuing kind of business as usual. And it's been a very, very busy time in the department. There is a current proposal for hazard pay, which Susie has proposed, and we're still waiting to hear the union's acceptance of.
Well, it's not just, it isn't, there's not a union acceptance. It's simply that I proposed it.
Gotcha. Thanks for that clarification. And so I think the point being that public works staff are currently very active, very busy, and very present in the city at this time.
Thank you very much. And I also want to give some kudos to Daryl Braithwaite, because we have a whole series of protective measures that have been put in place for our employees in public works. And Daryl has been consulting best practices of through webinars and that kind of thing for the best practices for public works employees. And I really appreciate the steps that have been taken. Now we have one of the more interesting topics, and that's the Recreation Department. Mr. Clark, would you like to speak to the Recreation Department budget?
Yes, good evening, everyone. Since the pandemic, the Recreation Department, and our programs and services have greatly been affected. We've had programs that we provide for the community, which are, in my opinion, major programs to include our before and after care programs, summer camps and things like that, which we are not able to have, which, major revenue providers for the city. Since those ended, and the pandemic began, we focused on trying to provide an outlet for residents. So we actually started a virtual community center, which is a place where residents can go and basically participate in activities and things virtually, just as a morale booster, as a way to keep going, a way to keep the community together. For FY21, we proposed a maintenance of effort budget with the exception of 2 recommended part-time staff positions. One is for a before and after care position at the Tacoma Park Recreation Center, which has been asked for by the residents of that ward. The other one is a part-time staff person for our youth success and outreach programs. This program is actually run by Javante McDonald, and right now he's the only staff person in that division. And if he's not there, then we, sometimes have to cancel the programs based on what's actually going on. So having an additional part-time staff to help him out and get programs out into the community would almost assure that, if he's unavailable, or that we can actually provide more opportunities to different parts of our community and different parts of our city and expand some of those activities. For FY21 and dealing with the pandemic, one of the things, the focuses that we've been focusing on the past few weeks has been how to operate, since the start of the pandemic. How are we going to provide childcare programs? How are we going to provide our camps? These are things that will more than likely require us to shift the way that we do business, to assure the health and safety of not only staff, but our participants. So we are currently in communication with other departments across the state, as well as nationally, on trying to figure this out. This isn't something that, we're just doing, but, this is an issue that we're trying to solve across the country. One of the other focuses for our staff has been how to, once we are all back in the facilities, is how to, what kind of provisions that we put in place for our classes, to make sure that residents are safe, our instructors are safe, and staff are safe in dealing with those as well. So those are the few things that we've been working on and for recreation.
Thank you. This is one of the huge discussion points when I'm on conference calls related to recovery planning, and every jurisdiction is raising the questions about programs, particularly that involve camps and after-school programs. Now we have the Housing and Community Development Department, and I'll speak to it briefly, and then I believe all 3 managers are on the line. The adopted budget was $1.9 million. The proposed budget is $2 million. Our original proposal was an enormous amount of work. Each of the HCD divisions, planning, housing, and economic development, have large workloads. They've been working on the implementation of the Housing and Economic Development Strategic Plan. They were working on, and still are working on, trying to assist businesses who are impacted by Purple Line construction and the traffic in neighborhoods that are impacted by Purple Line construction. Other significant work that they have been doing have to do with bus shelter and bike facility improvements, applying for grants, overseeing the rec center project, and coordinating responses to development proposals across the city, including at the Washington Adventist Hospital site. This is an enormous amount of work, and it's been operating for a year without a director. I have been functioning in that role to some extent, but given the amount of work in the department and trying to prepare for the next city manager, I really wanted to fill this position. Since the pandemic hit, the work is even harder. The staff of HCD are working remotely. They are working very long hours. They have organized additional one-on-one and funding assistance to residents, property owners, and small businesses. Absolutely creative, important, caring work. They've been preparing background maps to illustrate the assistance that we're given to help us make claims for reimbursements. And we anticipate that this work will be heavy and will continue throughout FY21. And as you will hear this evening, significant additional funds would be needed to continue to help residents and business owners. I think at this point, is Samira Cook-Gaines on the line that could speak to some of the implications for FY21?
Hi, Susie. Yes, I am on the line. Hi, everyone. Just to begin, I have to really state specifically for economic development and housing, it is not business as usual. All the things that Susie mentioned are continuing to happen, but now we are in a different level of emergency response. We've had some conversation about what that looks like, and we really see going forward, we're looking at 3 levels of response. So response, we want to respond and get the emergency piece done, but we also want to rebuild, and then we want to recover. That's really going to take us through FY21, and recovery is going to be long after that. So with that said, we have done some additional work around the budget that was proposed in your last budget work session. I know that you guys received some additional funding requests, and for us, that's where the above and beyond business as usual is really coming in. The first for economic development is around our mini grants program. Prior to this, the city has not had any direct funding to small businesses in a kind of concerted effort. I was hired to come into the economic development division, build it, grow it, and start some infrastructure for the city. That's what we've done. And I've done that with my full-time position and my full-time intern position. That is full-time payment without benefits. With that said, Susie, did you want me to cover additional funds, or do you want to talk about that later?
Why don't you go ahead and just say them now, and then we will talk about them later. But I think you could describe them better than I.
Okay, no problem. So originally, just to begin, our small business mini grant fund had about $38,000. And those funds came from repurposed economic development funds, repurposed housing and community development funds that were smaller pots of money that we could pull together for the $38,000. With that said, we've been fundraising to address the over 100 applications, which represent 529 employees. And for our long-standing businesses with an average of 11 years old. The stated need was $750,000, about $750,000 was our stated need. Again, we had $38,000. We have currently raised a total of $68,000, and more money is coming in. Excuse me, a total of $30,000, which has taken us to $68,000. Right. So moving forward, in order to really address the business assistance requests from the mini grant program, we do have an additional need of $115,000. With that said, the current budget budgets $5,000 for technical assistance. At that time, we were working with partners, specifically around Purple Line Impact, trying to figure out who's ready to pivot, who's ready to exit, who just needs more assistance and advocacy. At this point, our local partners are overwhelmed, and I am proposing $60,000 extra for small business technical assistance because we need a dedicated team for Takoma Park small businesses. This is not something where we can just lean on our local partners. They're doing a fantastic job. But as you know, as the time goes on, there's more and more responsibilities that they hold. The last two pieces really talk about this respond, rebuild, recover. That kind of three-phase of what it takes for housing and community development to kind of move through this pandemic. So when we move into the responses, what I just talked about, when we move into rebuilding, we still are going to need an additional $50,000 for midterm fallout, pivots, evictions, as well as things like, smaller things that are more like equipment changes and things like that. And then finally, we didn't talk a lot about workforce development, but as you know, the country is seeing unprecedented unemployment. Takoma Park already had higher unemployment than the national average. So at this point, the straits are dire. I am proposing an additional $20,000 for certification, training, retooling, and employment support. That's for workforce development. Now, moving into housing, similarly, there is a need to respond, rebuild, and recover. Currently, housing is at the stage of responding, and there's a requested $20,000 increase for the contract to local partners MUST, which support with the with emergency assistance, and that would be an increase to bring that account from $30,000 to $50,000. And then lastly, there's the crucial piece that keeps coming up in all of our conversations. It's the $100,000. It's $100,000 to really speak to housing needs in an effective way around eviction, moving expenses, keeping folks in their homes. And again, that's stage one response. Grace, you can feel free to jump in here to talk about rebuilding and recovery, but that's pretty much the bigger asks when it comes to housing and community development, and the idea that we are far beyond business as usual.
Thank you. And I'll just mention for a moment that these numbers that have just been identified are new based on us looking at what impacts we may need, and also they're responsive to some of the council members who've been asking for this. So there's nothing in these slides that shows these numbers, but as we talk about reconciliation, it's something that I'd like to have on the list. Grace Wiggins, would you like to speak for a moment about the housing needs?
Thank you, Susie, and good evening, Council. So I think we have all either individually or collectively talked about kind of what we want to see in terms of housing and, our commitment to the residents of the city of Takoma Park. Thank you, Samira, for doing that summary or providing that summary for Council. We're every day thinking about what the new strategy and approach will be as we hear from residents, and some of it is filling in the blanks of things that we didn't know existed. We don't know what June will look like once the courts reopen, if in fact it is June. We've been strongly encouraging residents to focus their attention on doing something to support their existing housing, whether it's a partial payment, and that's both for rent as well as for mortgage payments. We're also working very closely with condominium communities because they are also the backbone of our home ownership population here in the city of Takoma Park. And many of those communities are really struggling. We will be able to take some time once we get to the budget to figure out what the preparation looks like. We need a strategy. A lot of what we've been doing over the past 7 weeks is reacting. And we need time as HCD to sit down. I know Susie referenced our housing and economic development plan. We need to now look at that through the lens of what we're dealing with, and whether or not we will need some bridge programming to even get us back to the point that we were at when the council passed that important plan. But things have changed for HCD dramatically, and things have changed for our residents dramatically. The council is aware, last week we dealt with the death of one of our residents, and the toll that takes on staff, in addition to doing work. It can't be business as usual for us, because there's just fallout that, and tremors that you feel throughout the community. Even people who don't know residents that are either positive at this point or folks who've died, they're feeling it. And the fear is starting to, starting to ripple through our community. What can we do? Can we do building-wide testing? And we want to make sure that residents are keeping their eye on the ball, but we're in need of a moment to prepare, to strategize going forward. I've said we're running as fast as we can. We're a staff of 4.5 in the housing division. And as we look at each and every one of our systems, we're trying to figure out how to make them easier for residents to access, because we don't know when we're going to return to the community center. But we're also looking at how our other programs integrate with the other departments within the city government. There are no standalone programs. And finally, I'll just share this with council. I know my staff and I have talked a lot about redundancy. And what I mean by that is we want to make sure that we know what each person is doing. We want to make sure that we know what folks in other divisions are doing, because we don't know. It's a very uncertain time. And if a staff member becomes ill or has to take care of a family member, that means, and Susie can go into some of those details, there's only one licensing specialist, and there's only one rent stabilization specialist, and we only have one. So we're trying to work as closely as we can to prepare, create strategy to help our residents and to help help people get through this very difficult time, because some of this is about money and some of this is about helping our community remain together. And I know that the council has been very concerned about that effort, because lives matter, people matter, and this community matters. So.
Thank you very much. The planning division is overseen by Roz Grisby. And one of the things that I'll turn over to her, but one of the things you may have seen in the Washington Post this past weekend was an article about the importance of using the time of a pandemic to do infrastructure improvements, to do planning for the work that government needs to do. And so I'd like to have Roz speak to the work of the planning division during this time.
Yes, thank you and good evening. As we've talked about before, planning really provides the foundation for the work of much of the rest of the city, and it shapes the context. So our piece of it is really the rebuilding and recovery that Samira mentioned. And our work is primarily behind the scenes and it's long-term. So the redevelopment, the racial equity, those pieces that council has identified as priority in the sustainability, in the strategic plan, are ongoing part of our work. It's also very grant-based. So we're wrapping up a COG grant on the bus stop improvements, as you know, and the coming year will include making progress on the ADA accessibility issues, as well as the racial equity issues of providing shelters where the highest numbers of riders are, which are predominantly people of color. We also have a new COG grant, as you know, for a Maple Avenue Complete Street study, which will happen in FY21. Our Safe Routes to School programming is grant funded, and the New Hampshire Avenue Bikeways ongoing work, which is a long-term project chipping away at it, is also funded by Maryland Bikeways grants. We are working to look at what this pandemic means in terms of economic issues and the choices and options available to people as they move forward on that. So bike options, public transit options, traffic issues, the possible repurposing of public right-of-way. All of those are both critical and full of opportunity right now for us to take a serious look at them. And I think we also, I will mention it here, I oversee the arts as well. And so the creative economy is critically important and also really impacted by the pandemic. And we are working with the creative community, with the artists in Takoma Park, as well as working for the public to understand and appreciate and have some of the richness that brings to the community.
Thank you very much. One of the things that people don't know is that some of the staff that work for ROS do an enormous amount of grant writing and a lot of the important mapping and data collection that helps all of our different units. They've also, staff from HCD have also been helping our communications division get some of the words out and that we need to do. And so I appreciate that they've been jumping in every way, and really hard work. And speaking of communications, Donna Wright, would you be able to speak to the communications budget? See if she's there. I'll go ahead and speak, and she may come in on the line. Our communications division is kind of a compendium of our communications specialist, our cable TV, our city TV group, our newsletter, and together they comprise about, in the FY20 budget, it was about $540,000. Proposed is $640,000. This is the first year in FY21 where the amount of the communications division will have to have some general fund support. It's usually been wholly paid for out of cable franchise fees and offset by those fees. But as the numbers of, as people cut the cord, the amount of money that comes in on from franchise agreements has declined. So 23,000 of the 640,000 would come from taxpayer money for FY21. The increased demand for the communication specialist work is remarkable. And so even before the pandemic, she had asked for a full-time intern, which is badly needed. And one of the things that she also wanted to do was to plan for a website overhaul. We've looked at the funds for that, the time that's involved. And even before the pandemic, we were looking at FY21 as a planning year with the website overhaul work to be done in FY22. If you look at the website, I know where to go on it because I'm familiar with it, but many of the links for information are at the bottom of the page and people don't scroll down to the bottom. It's not an intuitive system. And it's also important every set of 5 to 7 years to update a website. So that is part of the work program for FY21. Cable TV franchise agreements for Verizon and Comcast are up again in 2021. So we'll need to spend time and have legal assistance to work with Montgomery County on the agreements. I talked with the person who's our contact in Montgomery County. I believe Comcast is willing to kind of just maybe do an extension because of the pandemic, but it's not clear that that's going to happen. And we've not heard an answer from Verizon. The newsletter is also out of communications, and it is an integral way for us to reach every household. Time and time again, when we do surveys, the way people find out information, especially in our communities of color, has been through the newsletter. When we go to pandemic, we have been slammed. The work of communication staff has skyrocketed. Our communication specialist has been working nonstop, and I don't think there's been a day that she has had off since we went into the emergency ruling. She does get the overtime money that goes to her, is something that is likely to be reimbursable under the federal rules, but it doesn't make up for the fact that she needs help. As I mentioned, a number of our housing and community development staff and others have been assisting. And then, as you know, City TV staff have been great in working to get our virtual meetings taking place. They've also been helping our various departments do their virtual programming work. So the primary increase for FY21 is for an intern. Now we have the budget for the library. Ellen, would you like to speak to the library budget?
Sure, I'll be glad to. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Our budget for fiscal year 21 restores some of the funds that were reduced this year, primarily for books, print materials, adult and juvenile, programming, conferences, and a small amount for media. We're also looking, right now we're doing many of our programs online, and we're exploring ways to do Spanish Circle Time online. The Friends have agreed to continue paying for that, and we will pick up the additional cost. And also we're trying to figure out how to do Summer Quest or summer reading program online. So we'll do that if we can. But our main focus for next year will be preparation for relocation and storage of our collections as we get ready for a new library. We need to find out where we will be continuing circulation services and programs. In addition, we've had some inquiries lately about is there a way that we can circulate materials while we're closed if closure continues for a long time. Some library systems have done that, so we're looking at ways we can do that too. And I'll be glad to entertain any other questions.
Thank you very much. The other things, I added a note here is that in talking with Jessica Clark on items that might be reimbursable under the various federal programs for cities, some things can be reimbursed if there are building improvements that help make an area safer and minimize virus spread. One of the things that I'm curious about and looking into is that there may be some building improvements that were being discussed as part of the kind of expanded library project, the restrooms in the main part of the building, for example, that if they are done in such a way that they're rebuilt so that there's not a need for as many doors or the same kind of doorknobs and faucets that we have now, some of those funds may actually be reimbursable. And if we need to do those, this may be the time to do that. So it's something that we're looking into to see if there's an opportunity to save some money on those aspects of the project. The non-departmental section of the budget is for things that aren't in a department and covers quite a wide diversity of expenses. It's adopted at 1.7 in FY20, it's proposed for 1.9. The non-departmental section includes insurance. It doesn't include health insurance. Health insurance is in the amount for wages by department. The non-departmental section does include, however, workers' compensation. It includes insurance that is liability insurance and that kind of thing. It includes our grants to community organizations. It includes the $160,000 we've set aside in funds to supplement the homeowner's property tax credit and renter's credit, and $50,000 to help offset a stormwater rate increase for some homeowners, as has been discussed. This is the location where we have the city's contribution to the Housing Fund Reserve that was proposed to be $110,000. $10,000 is the council's determination that funds that we received from the Tacoma Junction project should go to the housing fund. And so that's $10,000 for that. There is a significant increase projected in the amount for workers' compensation, but we never know the exact number until after the budget is adopted. With the pandemic, we know that there's some funds that may not be used, such as the funds for community festivals, which was up to $48,000. There's some funds for other community organizations' work that may not take place. But then in the community grant program, which was $185,000, these are programs that may be particularly useful for residents at this time. Also in the non-departmental account is $135,000 in general contingency funds, which are appointed or are allocated every year to be tapped into to cover unexpected operating expenses during a fiscal year. It's something that could be looked at given the emergency nature that we're dealing with. You also may choose not to contribute $100,000 to the Housing Reserve Fund this year, given other housing needs, some of which you heard from our HCD managers. And that comes to the conclusion of this third work session. And at this point, happy to answer questions. And then I think you wanted to talk a little bit about reconciliation tonight.
Great. Thank you, everyone. So if you have a question for the city manager or any of the city staff, please raise your hand and we'll have a discussion of what was just presented and then move on to a conversation about budget reconciliation. Councilman Searcy.
Hello. Thank you for this presentation. It's really helpful. One of the things that has been very, very challenging for me as I was going through the budget is not just thinking about what's in the budget, but also starting to think about the need that the city has for developing a plan for moving forward in terms of reopening and how that plan relates to the budget.
Right.
So part of a lot of the things I was doing today was actually trying to go through Governor Hogan's plan with an idea for to try to at least get a sense of timing of when certain things like the library may reopen, rec may be open, which appear to be phase 3 kind of things, versus like where we are right now, which is still having the stay-at-home orders versus safer at home guidance, which would be the next phase, which would involve our police, because again, we're allowing people, it's kind of like Groundhog's Day, where you go back to the phase of certain things are open, certain things you can do, certain things you cannot do, and how do we enforce that? So as I was going through the budget, part of the hangups that I had were, there were a number of instances where although the FTE count did not change, we made changes in terms of the salary level of the positions. So we basically reconfigured what we are expecting these positions to be and to do. And so as a result, the subtotals are higher. For those divisions where that is the case, can folks take a couple of minutes to talk through how you are restructuring? There was particularly the police department. I noticed that was pretty substantial for you all. I also saw, I'm just trying to pull up my spreadsheet, my handy dandy spreadsheet. I think the library salaries were also higher, and I saw about a $73,000 difference, and I'm not sure if that were an intern position that I didn't quite see somewhere else. I was just trying to figure out why it looked like the costs were different for that group as well.
So if maybe I can start answering a couple of the questions, and some we're going to need to get back to you on. The first thing I'll just mention is that I'm on one of the task forces that's looking at recovery. and recovery timeframes. And I had a conference call on Sunday with other representatives from other jurisdictions looking at that. Maryland and DC each have a series of task forces on different subject areas, and so we'll have to wait and see what those come back to. But fortunately, all the jurisdictions are looking at about the same base information. The national governor's work, the Johns Hopkins work that makes some recommendations. As you are correct, there's a number of things that are kind of in the later stages that might affect us. The biggest question has to do with really, is there some childcare that's needed for getting some of the original folks back to work? We will have to keep following that. In terms of the positions where the numbers went up, most of the cases that you'll see are professional positions that were raised to essentially deputy director type positions. So that's in finance and that's in public works. Those are areas where when we looked at succession planning for key positions, that was something that, I consulted with the council on, it's absolutely needed, especially in a time when we may lose people, which is something very scary, but it is something that we have to realistically look at. I do not know the answer on the library salary, so I will get back to you on that.
It looks like the adopted was at 1.06 mil. It looks like the proposed is at 1.15.
Yeah, so I'll check on that. There's probably something else going on there I need to find out. In the police department, we can get some more specifics to you, but some of the things were more changes among the various units and also being fully staffed, but I don't know exactly. So we'll need to get back to you on that as well.
Okay, great. Another thing that would be extremely helpful for me, because again, in kind of just making up numbers in terms of like dates, in terms of realistically the phase out, right? So if we're assuming that maybe folks kind of open up things a little bit and we could start moving about the building a little bit come June, and that then kicks off that first phase under the governor's plan where there's some limited businesses that are able to open and certain folks, but not everyone.
Right.
And then assume a little while longer, it'll be before we're actually able to do some other things. In my mind, it seems like perhaps maybe that first half of the fiscal year, leading up until the holidays at least, we may still be in this kind of phase-in thing. So one thing that would be really helpful for me is to, and again, my spreadsheet is very alarming. It was meant to be alarming so that we can kind of have some conversations and really shift our thinking in terms of not necessarily what we want to do and what we would like to do and what we plan to do, but what is realistically feasible for us to do if we're in a situation where our city buildings may not be fully open until October, November.
I appreciate that. And I think some of the things I haven't gone through all in great detail, and I still probably need to write them out a little bit more specifically, are what goes into the about $450,000, I think, $1,000 that I think we might have savings in FY21. I did get estimates from the recreation director on what it means to be closed through to December. So I'm also kind of looking at that 6 months of the first half of the fiscal year timeframe. What I don't know might happen, and part of the discussion that I've been hearing on these recovery discussions are the extent to which government employees may be involved in contact tracing or some of these other things that might be needed. We've already got vetted staff, they've already been cleared. So they may be people that are better than trying to go out and hire people and have to go through the clearance process if we need that kind of activity right away. Or if we are doing things, as has been mentioned by the housing manager, about working with an entire building, about getting some documentation about what their needs are, what contacts they need, what testing they need, that kind of thing. So there may be we may repurpose our employees in some ways. So for that reason, what I don't want to do, I don't want to say I'm not going to use these funds at all. You know, I want to be careful about how we think about the funds for FY21 to allow us flexibility. And if we don't use them, they go into the reserves and things can help with FY22. I recognize the needs of taxpayers to be very careful about their dollars. I want to be very thoughtful in all of these different things, but I don't want to cut something that then we find out we actually need in November. And so what is it that it takes? And so I very much like to present kind of, it's a work in progress about the plan, about how I think the year goes through, because it changes about every 3 days based on the new information that I get. But I am trying to space that out. I'm trying to think about it. I'm trying to prep our employees for that. So I appreciate it. I'd love to work with you on it.
Yeah, because I mean, in my view, it seems very logical and perhaps low-hanging fruit from a budget perspective to think about a hiring freeze for the first 6 months of the fiscal year, primarily because much of the work, it may not be possible for people to do it anyway, right? So then you have those dollars that we can then redirect. Another thing to consider, I don't know to what extent we are already thinking about amongst staff and reorganizing staff. So those staff who are maybe doing more programmatic work that is not necessarily in very high demand because, let's say, the rec center is closed, the library is closed, and the like. How are we creating those bridges so those staff, even if they're working remotely, can support those offices that are in desperate need of FTE and staff support right now?
Right. We're actually, we are doing that quite a bit right now. You know, not everybody can do everything, so there's that. But where we can, we are definitely using our staff, and we're trying to repurpose them. I have not anticipated, and I've put a hold on doing any staff hiring for summer camps and for new kinds of things going forward. There's a couple of key positions that I think still need to be filled. But since the pandemic started, everybody knew we have to be really judicious, and that there are people you don't want to hire for certain positions that are really just customer oriented. That's not where our work is right now.
So I look forward to seeing, you know, kind of that 6-month rollout. You know, again, my first thoughts are that 6-month hiring freeze, how we may want to think about costs associated with the whole reopening of things and where those costs may be reflected in the budget. I know that we've talked about the interns and our ability to leverage them. And I know that we've had a pretty good working relationship with universities and the like. But the intern faucet is something else we can easily turn on and turn off to free up dollars. So I definitely want to make sure that when we're talking about hiring freezes, that we're also talking, you know, the interns are a part of that equation. Sure. It would be very, very, very helpful for me to see the full list of vacant positions that we have right now, and our prioritize the list for hiring.
Mm-hmm. So I appreciate that. We tried to get some of that to you late this afternoon, but it didn't have the priorities on that, and that's something still to get to you.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful as well, as we're kind of thinking through not just this first 6 months, but the next 6 months, and as we try to make sure that we have dollars available, that there's dollars on the table for, you know, how things shake out for those priority positions. That would be like a second phase. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to take up all the time, but there was one other, so the council had an intern. I did not see that in the budget.
So you know what, it was hidden. And in fact, I didn't realize that it was, I remember hearing about it, and I thought it was in the city clerk's office budget, but it's actually supposed to be to help with the elections for July through December.
Okay, so so I would say the city clerk was another shop that I saw some weird subtotals. So I think that might be where that intern was, because I have it on my list as a question mark. It's about 41,000. That seems off. And my question was, I don't understand why there's an increase in some of these subtotals of about 41K. So if there was an intern for elections, it probably somehow was accounted for in the clerk subtotals, but might have meant to be with us, because I don't recall seeing an intern in our budget.
Right. So we'll get that clarified, but I do know that there's also extra money in the city clerk's budget for election expenses.
Yeah, no, this came from personnel subtotals. Okay. And so I wasn't sure if this was, you know, that vacant record specialist, but it was off by about 40K, which seemed weird. So I kept both of them on my spreadsheet, and it's line rows 15 and 16.
Okay, we'll look at that.
Thank you.
Great. Councilwoman Kostick.
Thank you very much. First of all, I just want to say a big thank you to all the city staff for the hard work you've been doing during the pandemic. You know, it's really useful to see the presentation both with the proposed budget as well as the pandemic impacts and the ways that you all have been responding. So thank you very much. I wanted to just sort of get a little bit of additional information on the general fund reserves and the way that we're setting ourselves up to be prepared for unexpected and potentially unbudgeted for expenses in the coming year. I understand there's the difference in the general fund balance, the general fund reserve balance based on the way it interacts with the bond reserve. And, you know, just a quick glance at it is very alarming, is, you know, noting that we should need 4.6 million to reach our 17% goal and only having 1.8 million. So I understand that there's the interaction there, but it's also incredibly complicated and hard to sort of grasp how those two interact. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and about our capacity to draw on those bond funds if there is an emergency. I understand that it's contributing to our 17%, but if there's an emergency and we do need to utilize those funds, do we have the capacity to utilize those?
Well, I will turn this over to the finance director in a moment, but we also have our general contingency account, which is about 135,000. We have our emergency reserves, which is 510,000. There's been quite a lot of discussion about using some of the housing reserve for some of the things that may be that might meet some of our housing goals during this time. So my preference would be to be going into those locations for funds first. Ms. Chung, would you like to speak a little bit about trying to describe the interaction between the unassigned reserve and the library reserve? See if she's on. I'm not sure if she's available at the moment. Basically, what happens is that we take money from what was the unassigned reserve and we put it in a separate fund called the library, a bond reserve. And this is essentially a guarantee that we will be doing a project for the people who have invested in the municipal bonds. As we are spending down on the library project from the library bond, our borrowing money, then the library bond reserve is freed up into the unassigned reserve. And we anticipate at least $1 million from that to, okay, I now see a message that Ms. Chung is now unmuted. So Susan, would you like to speak a little bit to the bond reserve?
Yes, you hear me? You can hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm so sorry. Yes, the bond reserve is a little bit confusing from the very beginning. And I want to speak to that as the origin of the bond reserve is coming from proceed from the borrowed funds that we have from CDA. I don't know if you remember our bond issue. It was on August 2017. And we have some costs related to the issuance of bond, about maybe a few $100,000. So the net proceed for the bond from the library bond is about $6.9 million. And we also have $2 million for the transportation bond. And the transportation bond is completely almost used up. So there's no issue with the bond reserve about the transportation bond. The only thing that is right now in the bond reserve is the amount that we receive from the borrowed fund for the library bond. And it's about 6.7 million still remaining in the bond reserve. And it is accordance to the GASB Rule 54 that we need to restrict the fund when we are getting those funds from the borrower, from the lender, which is the CDA Council. And I have asked before I started with this bond reserve, I have asked several other entities like the GFOA and also our auditor. And this is basically the best practice from all the local government that we needed to do that, because we actually have to make sure that we are using this fund for the specific purpose of the project. So that's why we have that bond reserve restricted. It's called a restricted fund. And the unassigned reserve is basically the remaining fund after the restricted fund is repurposed, and also the contribution of the ERR, and also the contribution of the housing reserve, all those contributions being made and the restricted reserve being removed, the remaining amount stays in the unassigned reserve. So that's why the unassigned reserve seems to be small in amount, but actually these different type of reserve like the ERR, emergency reserve, and also the FMR, the building maintenance reserve, the housing reserve, they all take part of the unassigned reserve away. That's why it looks like the unassigned reserve is so small. I don't know if you notice that from our CAFR, this is how the fund balance is being segregated into different sections. There is an assigned reserve, there is a committed reserve, there is a restricted reserve, and finally the remaining part is called unassigned reserve. Okay.
So it's not very clear. I get it.
Yeah, we have to usually study the CAFR, and there is description of what is the purpose of different type of reserve. So I'm just saying that it's a little bit complicated, but we needed to maintain the bond reserve in order to be in compliance with the GASB rule. I'm sorry.
Councilmember Kostick, I think one of the things that you may be trying to get to, and I know there's concern all around, is how do we get through this budget, and what do we have if there's significant unanticipated expenses? And it's something that we look at very carefully. I think we're doing a number of the kinds of things that make sense. We're not filling positions that we don't absolutely need. We're not just spending money because it's there. And we're looking really carefully at these other reserves. I think the best we can do is make the best educated guess, and then ensure that we're not having such a small property tax rate or whatever that we hem ourselves in. And so it's a tough balance. I don't want to give an impression of just using the property tax rate here, but I do think we have to be really conscientious of how each component goes together and what flexibility that we have. And as Councilmember Searcy mentioned, I mean, we're looking at what happens over the next 6 months or so to even get some information.
Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate the description regarding the bond and how it interacts. Yeah, I think my biggest concern here is kind of twofold. And part of that is, as you said, just making sure that we have adequate reserves and we have, basically we're meeting our intent with setting that 17% reserve goal, which was to ensure that we're in a good place and that we can react if we have some type of emergency or something comes up. So yeah, wanting to make sure that that is achieved. And also, I think one of the challenges that we're all sort of struggling with in looking at this is just looking at the budget and adopting the budget, but also understanding that some things in the budget may be on hold and may need to be on hold. And so I guess I'm just kind of wondering how we can best identify that in the budget and how we can best make it clear that that is our expectation as we're going through this process.
I think that the best thing to do is to is just exactly what we've been talking about, which is having a list of those items that we think, oops, all of a sudden it asks me if I'm leaving the meeting. No, I'm not. Having a list of items that we recognize we don't want to spend on right away. We'll have the funds if we are okay to spend on them. But, we're not going to be, I think part of what you can put even in a budget ordinance is a list of those items that you identify that we'll look at on a quarterly basis or whatever makes sense as to check in on and to say, look, yes, these are in the budget, but we're not encumbering those funds at this moment. We are waiting to see what the status is of the economic returns on these things. If there's some federal money for state and local governments, if there's some enormous staff costs that we have to deal with because of risk or whatever those things might be, which I hope we never get to that point, but recognizing that we're in uncharted waters in some respects. And so I think having that just listed in the budget ordinance is a very clear direction.
And I will say that, just building on what the city manager is saying, in the budget ordinance, we can also put language like we do in other ordinances that spell out the intent of the city council. So we can, just as we've done in the past. And I think this budget, probably more so than any other, it will be important to lay out our intent because there are elections coming up in November. And so, I mean, that's the reality, right? Like, depending on what people decide or how the outcome of these elections, we may not be this full council may not be the same council that sees this budget all the way through for a year. And so really, I think being clear about what, as we're going through it, our intent is, so that whoever takes over again, whatever the composition of the council is, post the November elections, that is understandable in terms of some of the decisions and the process we've gone through now. I think that'll be really important.
Yeah, and it's really important to me to have those kinds of things written out. I mean, it's helpful to me personally, it's helpful to the department heads. And if I'm incapacitated or something else, somebody's going to want to know what those directions are. So I really look forward to that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it will be very important to have it spelled out so that it's not just something we talk about during this process, but is very clear. Correct. Thank you.
I had a question for Samira Cook-Gaines, our economic development manager. She's still on, or if somebody else could answer. I was just trying to look through my notes in the former presentation of how much money was in the budget for the economic development. I think it was for facade. Was it $20,000? And we had talked about the potential for moving that money.
No, I am still on. So the way that worked, there was the neighborhood commercial district improvement. That was 75,000, of which about 50,000 of it has to match the grant that we already have. There is another 25,000 that Councilmember Costick asked about in the last work session. and whether we dedicate it to the mini grant fund or what. And again, that's why I gave the new numbers of what's really needed. So there is a $50,000 piece of that needs to be a match. But then there's the other 25,000. Then the plans were to use that for additional, community, neighborhood commercial district improvements in the other parts of the city.
I think Councilmember Kovar is having a hard time hearing.
Trying to get him.
Okay.
Did I need to repeat anything?
No, we can film it.
Okay.
I think we lost him for a second, and he'll try and get back on. Why don't we go to yeah, go ahead, sorry.
I also think that was included in Susie's write-up this evening. There's a spreadsheet.
Oh, was it? Okay, then I missed it because I was trying
There's a spreadsheet piece of it that talks about an additional $25,000 for neighborhood commercial district improvement to put it on, I guess, quote unquote, hold for further discussion. So that's with the assumption that the 50,000 would be there for match.
Got it. Okay. Great. Councilman Searcy?
Still don't seem to be able to hear anybody.
Can you call in?
Yeah.
No, you're good. You go. I was sorry.
Someone else go.
I do want to go back to the point that Councilmember Kostick raised about, making sure that we're all on the same page in terms of those items that we consider to be hold. I think it's really important for us to continue to keep in mind that hold still means we need to make sure that there are resources in the budget to some degree to pay for them. So while we're still going through the budget, if there are things that we as a council feel are not priority projects or things that can wait, and it's hard, but there are some things, quite frankly, that may be council priorities in the past, but given COVID, when we look at them, we recognize they can wait. And so identifying those things that we think can wait until the next fiscal year is, I think, going to be very important, and maybe the only way that we might be able to free up dollars without, kind of just snatching money from reserves, which is also an option. But it may be one of the only ways that we can really free up the money so that we're not, we don't necessarily find ourselves in a situation where the only way that we can hold all of these things, precious style, is to keep taxes either the way that they are, or, you know what I mean? So I just want to kind of stress that, from my view, we have a couple of priorities as we're trying to go through the budget to think through. One, what are the things that we think are critical for COVID that have to be done and people need, and if we don't do it, we're basically putting all of us at a disadvantage. Two, what are the things that are really mission critical? We need to do them to keep the lights on, to keep our staff employed, what are those mission critical things? And then in my view, everything else, quite frankly, we may not want to stop it, but they're discretionary. We can choose to stop certain things and put them off until the next fiscal year, and it wouldn't negatively impact our budget. It just means we're doing it next year. And so trying to identify some of those things that may be discretionary, I think, is the really hard part. And I think that may be some of the, help that, staff can provide as well. I know that at the time in which the budget was being developed, you all had already done a sweep and kind of did a scrape. But it might mean doing another scrape in light of COVID to say, hey, you know what? We were going to put $25,000 towards X, and in reality, we can wait. Having that information from you all, I think, is going to be really helpful, because that will enable us to make sure that we're making decisions that can kind of push some of those lower priority things. And that kind of goes back to the SIP conversation as well. Some of those things that are in the budget that may be lower priority that we may be able to wait to the next fiscal year to do, to free up some money. So I just want to encourage us to not just put everything on hold because that still has implications for our tax rate, but to think about what those things are that we might be able to identify as a lower priority item that we could maybe start in the next fiscal year.
Mm-hmm. Councilmember Cersei, I think one of the issues that as you're thinking of those kinds of projects, those kind of priorities, you're going to have to think 2 or 3 years from now, because next year the money's not going to be there, and so part of this is how do we level things out over time, and it's looking at that as a longer window, and so that's part of that discussion that we have to have. When you say something's a lower priority and it can go for next year, you're going to really need it next year, or else it's going to be in the following year or maybe the year after that. So part of this is really thinking, you're not just going to get a traffic calming next year. It might be farther out, or it may be in a whole different kind of, it may be striping and not some bump out or whatever.
Mm-hmm. And I think also just thinking about the idea of us looking forward and planning on like what the need is now, what is going to be the need in the future. In terms of our residents, the near term, as a number of folks have said, is going to be what happens on that day when the emergency declaration is lifted. What happens particularly to renters in our community? That's going to be huge. And that's sort of the first line of folks who are going to feel it in our community. Because for those people who are struggling now to make their rent and debt may be piling up, once the courts reopen again and evictions can happen again, how are we assisting those residents? That's our first line. This year, folks who have mortgages will have mortgage forbearance. We're going to probably have to assist homeowners a year from now. And then I think the folks who own condos, it's going to be spread over this year and next year. So while I agree there are some things we need to cut and think about, I want to caution us not to think about pushing it just to next year, because we need to be thinking about the need, and our reaction to COVID-19 is going to be a multi-year process. The recovery from this isn't unfortunately going to be just 1 year. We are going to be feeling the ripple effects of this in our budgets for the next few years. So while I do think we can push things, and I agree with many of the things that Councilman Searcy talked about, really thinking about when we're going to be able to just do certain things to push them out. I think we also have to think about who is going to be most in need in our community and when. And I see it first and foremost, it's going to be renters right away, and they're going to need a lot of assistance to keep them in their homes. It's our small businesses, because if they miss payments, go under, it's so much harder, almost impossible for them to come back. And so for me, as I look at these numbers and I think about our budget, particularly what has been said by Ms. Wiggins and Cook Gaines, I'm really seriously looking at those numbers in terms of how do we make sure we keep people in their homes and keep the businesses able to reopen. So I just wanted to have us think about those things. And let's see. Oh, I have more hands. Councilwoman Dabala.
Well, hi, everybody. I want to take us back a step, although maybe this is, anyway, I wanted to back up to some of the costs that were gone over today in a couple of the departments, and specifically on police. And there are a lot of overtime numbers in there, and I appreciate the chief's efforts over the past year to get a handle on overtime. And what I'm not clear on is what changes as a result of COVID, and maybe there's not an answer for that right now. Maybe that's an answer we get written down,
Chief,
sent to us.
Chief, you can answer that one, right? I mean, I know the answer too, but do you want to address that?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of unknowns. A big part of our overtime budget is related to some of the events, 4th of July and other events. So, right now there's a big unknown. Obviously, there's no court, so we're not having that court overtime. But at this point, we're trying to calculate out, are we going to have these events? When does court come back in? So there's a lot of unknowns at this point. So, like I say, depending on what events we have, National Night Out, some of these other events, it's all a big what if at this point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's no way to get a handle on that right now.
Well, Councilmember Dabala, I mean, I do, I'm more and more convinced that we're looking at into December. So I just don't see summer and fall events in any kind of large gathering way taking place.
Okay.
I could be wrong. I'm not the one that sets that rule, but I
can be disappointed, but
I just don't see 4th of July. I just don't see the folk festival. And those are ones where both police and public works put in a lot of time.
Yeah, and I wanted to thank everybody that's worked so hard on the budget and also so hard to, in the last few weeks, to convert to virtual programming and working at home and all that. It's been awesome. It's been a privilege to work with y'all. That doesn't make the budget questions any easier. And I had another question for the police chief about, I was a little confused about FTEs for operations and criminal investigations, and again, what the budget says now, and how that might change as a result of COVID.
Well, just so you know, our FTEs have not changed. What we did is when we were understaffed last year, we moved all of our SAT team and some of our CID staff over to patrol. So they were the frontline officers.
Okay, so
now that we're fully staffed, is we've restructured and put back those units in place. So now that we have sufficient staffing in patrol, and that's why you'll see the numbers moving from operations over into investigations. We're going to add additional detectives and also add our special assignment team back, which is our plainclothes team. So that's why you're not seeing a change in overall FTEs. You're just seeing a change of moving back staff from operations when we were short staffed to our investigation staff, which is our special assignment team and our criminal investigations team.
And then with that, some shifting costs because different staff cost different amounts of.
Well, it's the same staff, essentially, okay. FTEs, same number of supervisors, same number of officers. It's just a matter of where those numbers go. So instead of those numbers going under operations, they're now transferred from operations over to investigations. But as far as the positions, no, the positions haven't changed. We have a defined number of sergeant billets and assigned number of lieutenant billets, et cetera. Those all stay the same. It's just a matter of where they're assigned.
Okay, thank you. That's it for now.
Great. Councilmember Smith.
Thank you for this presentation on the budget. I want to thank Ms. Cook-Gaines for her presentation specifically about the business community and breaking it down to 3 different issues. Emergency, rebuild, recover, and I would add one more, that's freeze. I think that we should freeze everything in this FY21 budget to what it was in FY20, including just increasing the tax rate to the constant yield. What I'm hearing about, COVID-19, even if some of the restrictions are loosened, people are not going to be able to go back to business as usual, which means that sales are going to not be even close to what they were the last quarter. So that means that the tax revenue that the state's going to see, the county's going to see, is going to be on a much lower amount than what they did last quarter or last year. So I don't see how we're going to see any type of recovery for this fiscal year or even for this calendar year. I think that we need to really start looking at what FY21, FY22 is going to look like, and maybe in FY23, because I think this is going to be a long, deep recovery for a lot of people in our community. I think a lot of people are going to need assistance. Yes, there might be forbearance in people's mortgages, but the mortgage servicers have said that once that forbearance is up, that the borrowers will have to pay a lump sum to get their mortgage back into good standing. So we're going to have to come up with, I think, a lot more money than we're talking now to help residents. We're not going to be able to help everybody, but I want to make sure that we can help more than one or two residents in our community. And so I would like to put on our budget reconciliation list that we take $250,000 from our housing fund and make it available for business owners, small business owners in the community, and for renters and possibly homeowners also. But I appreciate what everyone's done in this budget, but I don't think we are in a position to have any type of new positions for FY21. Thank you.
Thanks. Councilmember Kovar.
Just want to make sure I can be heard now. Can people hear what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Sorry, when I think you were trying to recognize me earlier and I just couldn't hear anything. So I'm doing it via the phone now. So thanks for all the information. I appreciate it. I do have some questions, some narrow questions about some of the specifics that were presented tonight, and I'll send those separately. And I just wanted to comment more generally on the steps I think we ought to take. And I mentioned this to my colleagues and to staff, but I agree with those who have said that we need to be prepared to provide a lot of assistance to residents going forward. I think the challenge is that we have to work on our budget right at a time when there really is just a high level of uncertainty. And even in terms of what type of funding we might get from the county, we won't even know that. They'll be deciding that, you know, in the month after we have to decide. And so I've mentioned this previously, but I think, and this builds on what other people have said as well tonight, what we need to do is, in my opinion, number one, there are a series of cuts we can make to bring the tax rate down from where it is in the proposed budget. But additionally, I'd like to see us set aside a significant amount of funding in the budget that we can then, I mean, I've called it kind of an escrow or put it on probation or something of that nature, but escrow is probably as good a word as any. And then quarterly, we would look at it and then try to assess, do we use that potentially for the purposes it was originally intended for if things go well? Do we otherwise use it to provide direct assistance to residents and business people? Or do we use it for filling gaps for funding levels that end up being less than we might have anticipated prior to this from other levels of government, in particular the county and the state? And so in that connection, what I've proposed is that we don't go forward for now, although the amount of money would still be provided in the budget, with the sidewalk and street resurfacing work and this year's contribution to the equipment reserve fund, as well as some other of the smaller capital projects that are rated 3 or 4 as opposed to 1 or 2, which means that they're lower priorities. And I would say also don't put the extra 100,000 into the housing reserve. So that's somewhere in the neighborhood of between 1.5 and $2 million. And my notion would be all that would be set aside. Now I recognize some people won't agree with me on the specific places that money like that could come from, but those strike me as things that could be not done in 1 year, and then we could see where we were in the next year. Understanding that you don't just pick them off and do all of them the following year, as I think the staff has pointed out, that they get pushed off over time and we get back to them when we get back to them. But to me, that would allow us to take a chunk of money like that, a substantial amount of money, particularly if it's combined, as I've mentioned previously, and as Councilmember Smith mentioned, we also have some money coming from the housing reserve, specifically for renters and potentially for homeowners as well. And I would say, in addition, our grant funds, to the extent we can, and maybe this doesn't apply to multi-year grants we're already underway on, but our other grants, we should, to the extent we're able to, shift those into COVID-19 type relief as well. And so if we adopt a version of what I'm talking about, then every 3 months we look at it, and then we can assess, okay, here's how much we got from the county. Now we know what we're in line for from the county for the coming year. Maybe here's what we get from the different federal legislation that's passed that has to go through the county and the state, as I understand it. Here's what the income numbers are beginning to look like. We get a share of that. And then we can decide, okay, we are going to devote this amount of money to providing direct services to people who are suffering because of the pandemic. And over the course of the year, maybe some of that money could end up being spent for the purpose it was originally approved for, but maybe a lot of it won't, and it will either fill the gaps that we otherwise have or help those who are suffering. And I think that type of flexible approach is the only way we can really get through this, because to me, what we want to do is, I don't know if the right word is a sweet spot, but we need to find a level of both some cuts from the budget as proposed, but also additional funds will be set aside. We may not spend, as I said, for the original purpose, but we don't want that to be such a level of reduction that we end up kind of creating a downward spiral that makes the situation worse. On the other hand, we can't just cruise along right where we were, where we thought we'd be 4 months ago and not make any change. We have to somehow find that middle ground that recognizes where we are, that gives us the flexibility to make these kinds of changes, but that doesn't make changes so deep and reductions so steep that then we're in some ways worsening the problem in terms of making it harder for staff to provide services and assistance to people who need it. So I know that's a long explanation, and I have shared some of the more specific details with my staff, with my colleagues previously, but I had staff with my colleagues previously. But I think some flexibility like that written very specifically into the budget that we'll actually be able to look at every 2 or 3 months and assess what we're doing, I think is the way we're going to have to try to do this. So I will, as I said, send in my narrower questions to the staff later, but that I think is the approach that we should be taking. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Did you want to respond?
I just wanted to mention that, I think that I appreciate the approach very much. And we do need to have that flexibility. I do have a very strong opinion about reducing anything to the ERR. And I'll share that separately with council, but this is something that our finance director and I feel would be inappropriate. And so I'm happy to find and work with you on identifying other funds, but that is one location of funds that I do.
Well, let me just say on that, I'm not saying that we wouldn't provide that money. I'm saying we would provide that money and then set it aside and see where we are. And I wouldn't object if that's last on the list of all the things I'm talking about that we get to, so that maybe at the end of the year it does get replenished. But I think it would be a terrible idea to not put money into the ERR, to be honest. It's not funded. I think it would be a worse idea to have people in our city who need help and we can't provide it. And waiting 1 year on that is preferable to me to the alternative. So something we can talk about.
Councilmember Stevens.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I'd like to thank Ms. Ludlow and the staff for the great amount of work they've obviously put into the draft budget, and not only the draft budget, but then the revision to the draft budget for all the changes that you've had to think about and make to the draft because of the current crisis. And I realize this is all compounded by the fact that during the busiest time of the year, you've also had to switch from working at the office to working at home and take care of all the employees and ensure their safety. So I really appreciate the effort that everyone's put in, and I thank you for that. It's extraordinary, and it's extraordinary times right now. In kind of a perverse way, I find comfort in hearing my colleagues on the council, because I came into this with great fear about all the challenges we face this budget year. And my comfort comes from hearing that everybody kind of has the same opinion, that we are really needing to look at how we can cut back spending in areas that we normally would spend the money to prepare ourselves to provide for the community in unknown ways at this point in time. And I think we can guess what some of those things might be, but it's going to be an evolving circumstance. And like I say, I find comfort that my colleagues all seem to recognize that, and we're all going to be working together to try to come up with a plan. I would say that I like to associate myself with what Mayor Stewart and Councilmember Searcy said earlier. I think that we need to look for areas of extreme reductions in our expenses, and any of the programs that that we would like to do, but they're really not mandatory to be done at this point in time. But at the same time, there are some things that we do have to maintain so that we can continue to do business in a professional way and safeguard the interests of our constituents and the residents of the city. I don't want to single out the ERR, but I'll add that in with such things as road maintenance that are areas that if we don't do those mandatory things, would just be postponing the agony rather than postponing the benefit. You know, there's some projects we can postpone doing until a future date, but you have to take care of business, and maintaining our roads and not letting them degrade is important. And if we don't put the money into that this year, it's going to cost us more next year, and we'll be in more of a challenge at a time when we don't know what the future is going to be holding for us. So I'll leave it at that for now, but I thank you all for all the work that you're putting into this, the mind power, because you can make me look good. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Councilmember Siemens. So we've kind of, I think, morphed into a conversation of the reconciliation list. And just to remind people what we keep talking about, this reconciliation list, what does it mean? And so again, the way we do our budget each year is that the city manager proposes a budget, presents it to council, which she did on April 6th. And then we spend a number of weeks with presentations, asking questions, getting public input, and then what changes we want to see in that budget get put on the reconciliation list. So I don't know if the city manager did you want to share it, or?
Let's see, I'll see if I can. Not sure if I've got it here. Let's see. You know, I think I'm going to pass on
Okay.
sharing
I think
it.
I might have it. Let me see if I can. I have a.
Yeah, I think I just X'd it out. But I will say in the future, the deputy city manager is going to run the reconciliation list. So.
All right.
There you go. You got it.
Can you see it?
Yes.
I have no idea what you all see on my screen, but do you see a lot of other open documents or just that?
Just that one. You're
okay.
okay.
Good. And I think this is,
This is from this afternoon. So.
Okay, so this is from this afternoon. And so just to.
And then Mayor, on sheet number 2 is just a short list of kind of on hold items.
Right, that we've been talking about.
Correct.
Okay, so just so members of the public can read this and the city manager can help me with this. We actually started doing this a number of years ago, and I find it actually a really helpful tool to do reconciliation.
Mayor, can I just jump in for one moment? It says that I'm proposing not making a contribution to the ERR. I'm not proposing that. I'm proposing that would be in the same category as the sidewalk and street funds, which is to say that the money would be approved and set aside. I'm fine that wasn't fully understood, but that's not what I'm saying.
Okay,
that's fine. We'll take it off. I think that I will have to find out if there may be some legal reasons we can't put it kind of in a hold category. So I will confer with the finance director and our auditors on that.
Okay. But I will just take off that. But let's start at the top and describe what are people looking at here.
Of course. So the top of the categories where it says general fund revenue and then general fund expenditures in bold, that's what was in the proposed budget as the total revenues we were anticipating for the general fund portion of the budget and the total expenditures that we were expecting. On the revenues section, I mentioned earlier that about 171,650 are potential carryover savings from the current year budget. That could be altered if the council wishes to use some of that 171,000 for current FY20 expenses to help businesses or residents. But I went ahead and showed it here so that you saw that could be an addition to the revenues. Then I identified about $389,000 of revenues that we would not get from recreation, amusements and hotels, and parking revenue, and a few small other accounts such as that, which total the $389,000 of revenue that I'm not expecting us to get for FY21. Obviously that can change if recreation fees came back online, but I assumed that they would not for a number of months. On the general fund expenditures, sometimes it looks a little bit backwards because what's negative and what isn't. All of the expenditures are things that we would pay for. So one of the things that I put on is identified, I think it's about 5 positions that I would anticipate either not filling or not filling for the entire year that would total $421,000. Reduction in staff and conference training that I don't anticipate us going anywhere for. And I put in $30,000 for that. Again, I was kind of looking at a half a year time frame. And so those are expenditures that I had anticipated making in the FY21 budget that now I don't think we have to make. There was also proposals from the mayor to cut the resident survey. In the budget, it's confusing. There's $60,000 in the contract line in the city manager's account for the resident survey and another $20,000 for other contracts that could be associated with that. So you could choose 60 or 80,000. There were proposals, but without numbers, about adding to the mini grant program for businesses, the emergency assistance grant program. We heard some fairly large numbers that are being suggested from our housing and community development managers for those programs, some of which may be able to come from the housing reserve. Some aren't necessarily appropriate. You can write your description any way you want, but housing reserve doesn't seem like the best nexus for small business support, but it may be what you decide to do. Then there's proposals that, are just items that Councilmember Costick mentioned, potentially cutting assistance to festivals. And that $48,000, that's the amount that we would give to the entities of Independence Day and Folk Fest. It does not include the savings in police overtime, so that could be an additional amount of money that we could save for those items. There was some discussion about what should be the council compensation amount. I think the number is more like 117,000 that was added to the budget that we thought maybe came from the council compensation committee and its recommendations for both salary and fringes. I think it's I thought
it was 114,580. I wrote down.
Then you're probably right. If you got 114,580, let's go for that.
We were going through it before. That's what I wrote down. But
okay.
I'm just wondering if, and we don't have to do it right now, but could we split that into wages and fringe when we look more thoroughly at that? Thank you.
Sure. So then there's the police retirement amount that was raised, and I had proposed adding $50,000 to the amount that's above the actuarial determined amount that we would pay to the police retirement fund. I have not yet had my conversation with the actuaries to determine if that's how that might affect the situation that we're in. There's a cut of the IT position and not replace the intern, which would be 113,000. Then not putting 100,000 into the housing reserve. And as I mentioned, although it shows 110,000 as a contribution, 10,000 was identified by the council to be basically the rent payment for the property at Tacoma Junction, that should go to the housing fund. So you can change that, but that's why I just put 100,000 there.
Cool.
Could I ask one question?
Sure.
So the items that are in the, I don't know if you call that pink or buff or whatever that section is over there, but those are, depending on what the council agrees to, those are amounts that would conceivably be cut. But then the 389 that's in the green would have to be offset from that in terms of our understanding of the entire amount that we're talking about. Is that a fair way to think of it?
That's right. So basically, if you look on the right-hand side where it's white, it has the, if the goal is to keep the city tax rate at 53.97, then the expenditure savings provided the revenues are 26,756,794, then you would need to cut $601,500 to be able to maintain the tax rate at the 53.97 rate. For the items that are listed right now, that you're above that by about $350,000.
And that includes with the 389
That's correct.
loss in there too?
That's correct.
Thanks.
Cool. Well, I don't know if people
talked
I'm
about.
sorry, say that again.
So what this is saying is that right now, if you accepted everything on the sheet, you would be below constant yield. But that's before you might add in assistance to people.
Mm-hmm.
And so has anyone added cutting the sidewalk budget of $175,000 to the budget reconciliation list?
No, it's on the second sheet, which is a hold list as opposed to cutting it, but you could add it to the reconciliation list.
I would like to add it to the reconciliation list.
So that's sidewalks and traffic calming, the whole budget?
Yep, and yep, 175.
Oops, sorry. Okay.
Make sure you hit save, Kate.
So, I mean, I think one of the things that, you know, I do want to, oh, you gotta have another zero.
Sorry.
You're running it. That's great. So one of the things that I do want to caution is that it can look attractive to cut and see the expenditure savings. What we set up in terms of what this means for FY22 and FY23 is an important part of the conversation. And so as we go through that, we really do need to make sure that what makes sense not only for our current emergency situation, but the emergency situation we will have for FY22 and potentially for FY23.
Okay.
Former council members Tim Mail and Seth Grimes sent out an email, and one of their proposals was cutting non-departmental expenses. Do you have any comments on that? They said that there's a $110,000 increase for office expenses.
I don't know what that one is. I will go back and look at their list, but we certainly have items on this that are from the non-departmental budget.
Mm-hmm. I just added to add back the carryover, the 171.20, because I think given we're not yet in May and this budget ends June 30th, and again, looking at what the need is, I could see us potentially needing to spend that money between now and the end of June. And so I don't think we should count it as FY20 savings at the moment, because I think it's going to be needed. So I'm adding that to the reconciliation list.
Can I ask on the 171 or 171,650? Mm-hmm. That's obviously an estimate because we still have another, 2 months to go in the current fiscal year, is that right? So how firm should we think of that 171 figure as being?
I think it's a good estimate. In my email to the council members, I identified how I came up with the adjustments. I can go into a little bit more specifics when I go back to my notes. But there were about $400,000 in personnel savings and vacancies and unused overtime that I'm anticipating for this current fiscal year, as folks have noticed. And, part of the reason this budget year has been tough even before the pandemic is that I have a bunch of vacancies. And so, and one of the things that did happen was that when our former deputy city manager left, he's usually the one that goes through and scrubs the estimated actuals for FY20. And so there were some things that weren't corrected in the rush to get the budget document prepared just as we're going into the pandemic. And so about $400,000 in savings I did find, as well as about 14,400 net savings regarding the rec department's programs and expenditures. But then I had to reduce that by the amount of hazard pay to police and public works employees through June. About 34,500 in admissions and amusement revenue for this current year, 29,500 in hotel motel tax revenue, 30,250 in parking revenue, and about 21,000 in other categories. So we went through and scrubbed revenue that we're not expecting to come in at the same level for this current fiscal year, FY20, that we originally thought. The net change of that is the 171,650. Obviously, some things can change, but I think we looked at those numbers pretty carefully.
So if we decided, for example, to take that amount, whatever it is, and say, because maybe in another few months, funding will begin to come from the federal funds or other legislation, but right now is sort of the time when we're best positioned and most in need of taking steps locally to help residents and small businesses. If we wanted to do that and say devote as much of that as possible to helping people and businesses right now, could we count on, I mean, how much could we count? 150,000 or the whole amount, or only
You
a
can
lesser
use
amount?
you can use the whole amount. I'm comfortable about that number.
Okay.
So I just added a few other items that to the list that I had on mine. So we just talked about add back the carryover, cut money for council conferences. It's $11,000. I had a question that, so I'll just put it here, is on under the council partnerships, the play days, I believe is $10,000. Just going along the thinking that the likelihood that we will be up and running and having the play days next year is a question mark. Also, it's a small amount, but the commemorative signs.
Yeah.
And then I'm proposing to cut in half the land management budget. We had $30,000 budgeted, and from hearing the presentation of where we are in the process, and I'm open to staff pushing back on that or having more conversation, but it just seemed to me that that was a place where we could still keep $15,000 in to do some work, but it didn't really look like we were going to be ready to do a lot of work. And so I thought we could save $15,000 there, or potentially move it to some other places to assist businesses or something.
Mayor?
Mm-hmm.
I actually had on my reconciliation the full 30.
Okay.
With the idea being, and this is, I have a couple of other areas where I'm suggesting cuts in terms of outreach work, because the likelihood that we'll be able to have, lots of in-person meetings and focus group engagements and things over the next at least half of the fiscal year are going to be diminished, although, there may be opportunities, other approaches. I just kind of flagged this as one of the ones that we might be able to delay a little bit.
Okay. Were there other line items you want me to add here, or do you want to send them in later?
I could send them. I was a little cutthroat, but there's a few other ones. I guess one question for the city manager: the performance evaluation system contract. Is that something that we've already awarded? Like, where are we with that? I know this has been a project that we've been working on for a while.
I think it has not been awarded. Tracy, do you have an answer about that?
I don't officially, but I think that you're correct that it has not been awarded.
Yeah.
I might be wrong.
Yeah, I would flag that as a hold item, and if you all could just come back with a justification or a timeline, because I know this is one of the items that has been on the list for a while, or at least a project that we've been working towards for a while. There was about $30,000 in the budget for additional tree plantings. I'm just trying to find it. On the list. And I guess one question to Daryl, the Director of Public Works, is, what cost implications associated with foregoing additional tree plantings this fiscal year?
My recollection is that the budget includes the standard $25,000 for tree planting. So I don't know an additional amount other than that. And that's generally taken from the tree fund itself. So it doesn't have a budgetary impact to the operating budget. It's not tax fund based. So reducing that $25,000 in tree planting would not impact the budget. We did have an increase of $30,000 to be used towards a canopy implementation plan. or an inventory plan, depending on the decision the council made regarding those items. So that is something that could be on hold. That would be an operating budget impacted item.
Yep, that's the one that I found, and I wasn't sure if how that kind of would work out. But yeah, I would add that to the list.
And it was 30,000.
That 30,000.
Yeah, $30,000.
One question, and again, this is for Daryl, but there's a number, and we may need to just follow up with the sustainability manager, because I know it looks like there were a few things that were put in the budget in terms of special event funds. There was about $50,000 put in related to sustainability outreach. And I know that where we left things, in terms of the sustainability plan and kind of next steps in engaging the community and the like, given where we are with COVID, it would be helpful. And maybe, Mayor, we could just flag this as something to follow up on. But I am suggesting to reduce those costs. But I do want to make sure that we have an opportunity to run that by her when she's available. But in terms of the outreach, I think it's targeted at $50K. I had suggested dropping it by $30K, so it would be about $20,000 left for that fund, and reducing the special event funds by $10,000.
So it's a subtraction of 30 overall?
So it should be a subtraction of 40 overall. There was $50,000 in the budget for sustainability service charges, and it was like $50,000 in outreach.
Yeah, in regard to the sustainability budget, we've put into FY21 basically a similar budget figure to what we've had in the past 2 years, about 181,000. So we were attempting to kind of, what we've done in the past is unspent funds have been rolled over into the next fiscal year for potential. Given a lot of the unknowns, particularly related to public engagement, we wouldn't want to eviscerate the budget, but we do understand that there's a lot of things that we need to do that will not be able to be done, at least initially, unless we come up with some very creative ideas for enhanced public engagement. And that's kind of the critical next steps for the program based on the council's resolution and what Gina put forward previously.
Yeah, so if we could just, again, I know it may be, a little hard, but if we could just triple check in terms of those amounts. I mean, I'm leaving some money there, but I am being a little, I hate to say it, I'm being a little savage. In terms of the interns across the board, and we could just put this on the next, like as an item for the city manager to follow up on. I was not sure how many of these intern positions are currently vacant. I received a list of all of the intern numbers and where they would go, but not like how many of those are currently filled. So one question that I have is for all of those intern positions that are currently vacant, that are not COVID related, can we put them on the list?
Sure, we'll go through that list for you.
All right. So for the rec department, one question I had was about Monster Bash. I think there's about $11,000 in the budget related to Monster Bash. And I know we're kind of reading tea leaves right now. We don't know what's going to happen, but I don't know. Were you all planning, if we're not able to do Monster Bash as we've done in the past, are you all planning some alternative to that? Or should we consider that to be a part of, possibility of the events that'll happen this summer?
That can be considered for the reconciliation list.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're not I mean, I don't anticipate it happening. I really am thinking through December at this point. The rec department has gone through a long list of its various expenses. I have not taken every single thing about every single public event, but I've taken the bigger ticket items as part of this. So it's fine, I think, to put Monster Bash on the list.
Okay. And then
I'm just imagining Councilmember Searcy, you know, we could do a really good virtual thing with all kinds of interesting masks.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. So, you know, again, not trying to stop us from being creative.
Right.
And I have to just make sure everyone knows I was savage. I was just, if I didn't think it could be done, I marked it. So in terms of, and this kind of goes back to the rec as well, in terms of the rental of school facilities. So so the amount of money that we devote to, I guess this is the CUPF, are we anticipating that changing at all?
Actually,
with cancellation of events, or because right now we put about $27,000 towards that.
Right, and some of those funds were to offset costs of us moving into school facilities for some programs for library renovation. Yeah, that was in there. And in addition to that, with the new changes in how we may have to go about doing childcare with maybe one staff to, 8 to 10 kids, they have to be in separate rooms, things of that nature, we may need additional space.
Okay, all right. So we'll leave that one. That one was more of a question. And I think okay. So I also flagged, and again, Mayor, this isn't everything, and I'll send you a full list once I kind of go through and clean this up. But I did flag the $25,000 for public art. And city manager, if we can, in terms of those personnel savings, and again, my counts might be off, but it might be helpful for us to kind of think through the range, because based on the list that I had of the current vacancies, if we were to do a half-year full hiring freeze, that should be about 500,000. If we were to do a full year, that should be about $1 million.
Right, but I'm happy to go through with you on the details. There are some that I feel very strongly we need to move forward on, and there's some that I think are very likely not to be filled. So I'd love to go through those with you. As I mentioned before, there's a couple. I think my two most important positions that are not filled at the moment are the Deputy Director for Public Works and the IT Specialist positions. Those I feel are essential, and that we won't be able to function well without those two positions. The other ones, I have lots of, there's some that I don't see happening, and there's some that I think maybe half a year, and I'd love to talk to all of you about, exactly what I'm thinking of for each of those positions.
Okay, sounds good. All right, I've taken up enough of everyone's time. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I got, actually, Councilwoman Searcy, what was the performance software? Just if you have it right there, I missed
that. It's I think $87,000. It's for a performance evaluation system contract. It was, I guess, that performance to kind of do the performance reviews.
Yeah.
Right. That was the element that we have had on the list for a couple of years, and it has been a discussion point with our unions.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you.
Great. Councilmember Siemens, do you have your hand up from before? Or you?
That was from before. Sorry.
Okay. Great. Councilman Kostick.
I have a couple of quick things. A number of items I had been thinking of are already on here. And I just wanted to clarify, I think the item here, number 19, that was added regarding cutting the IT position, I think that was based on a question I had at a previous work session. I actually did not want to propose, I mean, maybe someone else does, but I didn't want to propose cutting the new IT position. I am
yes,
interested.
You did ask the question, and it sounded like it was a list, and I was kind of judging, but I went ahead and I didn't want to lose it, so I put it.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. I mean, I am interested in looking, and I don't have a specific thing in mind just right now, but I am interested in looking more closely at the other new positions, some of those, 0.2, 0.3 additions here and there in terms of new staff additions. But I think your point is very important with regard to the IT position and the need for that at this time in particular. So I just wanted to clarify on that. Could we get some clarification on, and then add to the list in the coming few days, the potential savings related to police overtime for some of the events that will not be happening?
Sure, we'll get that for you.
Thank you. And then the other thing was, I wanted to go back to stormwater again and just make sure I understand where we're at in terms of our thinking. And I know we talked about that, the 50,000 that is included here to offset that. One of my questions had been, and I know you may not have had a chance to get to it, but one of my questions was just in terms of the impact of that 50,000 here. Obviously people need to pay their property taxes for that 50,000. So are we really saving people much, and how much is that actually by doing that?
I just didn't get to that calculation yet, Casey. It's on my list. I'll get it to you.
I'm going to edit here because I had the same question too. So
yeah, if we can just put a placeholder for that stormwater funds, that would be great. Thank you.
Great. All right. Councilmember Kovar.
Yeah, it's just, I had one other question and one other comment. I believe there's funds set aside for facade improvements in the commercial areas.
Right.
And is there a separate grant from elsewhere that goes along with that?
Yes, that was part of what Samira Cook-Gaines spoke to. So we have $75,000 for the neighborhood commercial improvements. 50,000 of it is a match, is required to be spent because it's a match to $100,000 that we got from the state. And the other 25,000 was for other locations. I believe that 25,000, I mean, it certainly is on the sheet number 2 list, but I don't know if it's on the list as a potential.
Well, I guess the question I would ask is whether, what kind of constraints there are with that matching grant, because I don't think personally in the current situation we want to be spending a lot of time and effort on the facades when some of the businesses themselves may be struggling to stay in business. So I don't know whether it's possible to find out whether there's any flexibility on the use of that grant. And I wouldn't expect you to have that answer now, but
yeah, we can check, but that's a capital program from the state.
Right.
It's not something, I doubt it is easy to move. I'd also argue that, frankly, this is something that is important over the long haul. So it's part of our partnership with the state. I think, if we find out some
over the long haul,
sure.
I just think it may not be, we may not want to be in a position of fixing a facade over a place that's gone out of business. So I mean,
this would be for the property owner, not necessarily the business owner, and that's a different situation. Right. Yeah.
And this is Talisha. One thing that I would argue, like now, might actually be a very important time to make sure, particularly if there are certain storefronts that unfortunately go out of business, that they don't look vacant. So the more that we can do to make sure that even if we happen to have empty storefronts, they look occupied, the better off we will be. So if there's a nicer facade and the like, I think that's going to be really, really helpful if we should find ourselves in a situation where we need to fill empty storefronts or encourage new businesses into empty storefronts. Again, you know, I know that we had talked about, you know, the possibility of moving that 25K around a little bit, but I do think that it's really, really, really important for us to leverage that grant match so that we can go ahead and get some of these storefronts improved, because if they look a mess and we have empty storefronts, like that's not going to help us at all.
And I do want to jump in here and just really speak to the fact that this economic development piece around the small businesses and around facade improvements is really about a community livability piece. So if you have a cute little commercial district, you're fine. It's similar to the discussion around lighting, right? If your lighting is dark, your neighborhood looks like it's not cared for, it breeds other things. And we're stepping into an area where everyone is going to be seeing more and more economic hardship. So I want us to make sure that, especially since this grant was a grant that really speaks to an area that has been disinvested for over 40 years. Over 40 years, I really want to emphasize that there's a need, an economic development need. It's really hard to, it's really hard to sell a home that looks run down. But it's really a great thing to have a community feel like the city continued to care for it. So I would just really lean on that emphasis around facade improvement. I do think it's important. I also think the relationship with the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development is extremely important. They absolutely loved our grant proposal. And we're looking forward to seeing that happen. So if any adjustments are, going to be given to that program, it's a 2-year program. And if I ask for any adjustments, my suggestion would be maybe an additional year before we start the actual, facade building of it, because there's a lot of front work on that before you actually see facades change. So it's a 2-year program. If I made any changes, I would ask for an extension of 1 year.
So the other thing I'd also like to mention is that one of the elements that we're trying to deal with too is the interrelationship between a business owner and a commercial property owner. And some of our commercial property owners have been understanding about rent relief, and others have not. And so part of this is can we leverage some things too to help some of our commercial property owners be a little bit better neighbors with our business owners. I don't know that this is the place for that, but it is part of the discussions that we're having on a day-to-day basis with our commercial property owners.
Thanks for all those clarifications. Just one other question. So on the chart on the left, the general fund expenditures, the $33,440,000. Again, this gets back to what we periodically keep talking about, but that includes the bond reserve also in that total. Is that correct?
That's right.
So it's the bond reserve.
Not in the general fund expenditures. I don't believe so.
So what's the difference between the
so there's a number of
revenues and the expenditures?
There is a number of, I will get the answer in writing to you, but it is the difference between the monies that are in the various reserves. So
but the reserves are what explain the difference between the 26 and the 33, whether it's the bond reserve or other reserves. Is that right?
I want to make sure I get exactly it worded correctly. Okay. So I'm going to postpone the answer on that.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I just added a couple of items here. Adding to the emergency grant program, I'm going to put in for now, and it may change, $20,000. And I think we The workforce development was another 20. I'm going to add here. And I'm going to keep the mini grants program in the small business. I need to like look back at those numbers. So I'm just going to leave those blank, but I would like to add that back there. And on the housing reserve, the 100,000 for the housing reserve, I want to make sure I'd like to move that to a rental and condo owner, specifically targeted for that. And we may add more money from our housing reserve, but I don't want to lose that. So that would just be a dash there, I think, because it's already in the budget. Okay. Councilmember Kovar, you just went. Councilman Dabala.
A few things, a few reactions to what we've already been talking about. Going to the $421,000 that the city manager put on the list. It would probably help. I have some of the same questions that Councilmember Searcy has about positions and positions and overtime and vacancies versus new and all of that. So maybe if you gave us a little more detail on that at some point, like you did for the other two numbers, the fiscal 20 savings, the net carryover, and the fiscal 21.
Yes, I will do that.
I will
also say that I haven't talked to some of my department directors.
Okay.
So I wanted to let them know first what I've included in that list.
So along those lines, then I think it might be the case, Councilmember Kostiuk just asked this, police overtime related to events that are not going to happen. Is that already in there, or is that a separate line item that you could give us a number for?
I think it's a separate line item, and so that's something that we can get to you.
Okay, great, thank you. Some of the things that are on the list I'd like to see put on the hold list as well, pending some of the answers to questions that have been raised. I don't know if we need to do it this minute. I have a couple of other suggestions that were just, or do you want me to try to do that right now?
You can send it.
Yeah, you can send it.
Okay. I was a little unclear whether the $175,000 for sidewalks and traffic calming was the new sidewalk money of $100,000 and the sidewalk repair money.
I wasn't sure what that 175 exactly meant, so I was going to follow up actually to see what that might have been.
Okay,
because
so
we had
because it's getting late, to just cut to the chase. We have these things on the hold list. I'd like to also put on the reconciliation list for street maintenance, 50,000, and for ADA sidewalks, which is a total of 500,000 from all the accounts. I'd like to put 50, just to see whether we would maybe need these to balance at some point.
Sorry, what was it for the street maintenance?
I had said 50,000.
And ADA sidewalks?
I had said 50,000.
Okay.
And then going back to fiscal 20 for a minute, there was the 22,500 for property tax relief.
I did not carry that over, so you may want to spend it or not.
So how would I indicate that we might want to redirect that? Where does that go on these lists?
You could add it into one way. You can just say it because it's in the FY20 budget. You could add it under the reserve line as 22,500 that you would carry it over as an addition to the reserves to the revenues for FY21.
And are we sure we're not going to need that for existing property tax relief?
No, it's a decision. It's a decision for you. I think, I guess part of the reason I didn't put it on the list for under the general fund revenues for FY21 is I assumed you might want to be using it for FY20.
For FY20.
Well, I mean, you can identify using it as part of, you could add it to the stormwater amount or whatever. So you may want to add in a line, Mayor, since you're doing such a great job driving the spreadsheet, you could, under the net carryover from FY20 savings, you could add a line and add an additional line and put a carryover of the 22.5.
Just to remember that we have that, and maybe we want to redirect that in this current year to some other assistance program, or maybe we want to carry it over for the next year, but not to lose it. Are there other contracts or efforts that are related in fiscal 20 to outreach? And for example, on the rec center, have we signed that contract? Does that get carried over? Does that get redirected? What's
that? We signed that.
Those outreach.
Yeah, we've signed it. Samira Gaines, do you want to speak a little bit about what she's doing?
Sure, absolutely. We have signed the contract, and what we've done is extended the contract. It was a 6-month contract. Because we thought by the end of this calendar year, we'd have the reporting back and all of that. We assumed that the work would have started right about now, actually in April, and we would have had 6 months. And then toward the end of the year, we would have been moving forward in a different way. Currently, our contract extended for an additional 6 months, but on top of that, we have paired our consultant with our community engagement tech firm. Remember last year, we were selected into the City Innovate cohort. There were 2 tech platforms. One was for community engagement, the other was for business engagement. The one for community engagement is currently working with our community engagement firm to kind of pivot and redirect some of their community engagement activities to happen online. So she's, we're having actually regular meetings about once a week. Additionally, when we had the loss in our community last week, we tagged in with her team, which if you guys will remember, her team is very multicultural. And a number of her team members from the Ethiopian community in particular weighed in on how the city should and could respond to that loss, and moving forward, how we can engage the community to support each other in a way where we don't, in the way where we're socially distant. We're using, luckily, you guys really were supportive in approving the infrastructure measures I tried to instill last year. And lo and behold, they are coming in handy because we're able to put those two partners together and still engage with the community. So she's still moving forward. We definitely signed the contract. We have it for a longer time span now, but I'll probably have a better update on that contract toward the end of it and let you know how the spending is going.
That sounds great. I ask in part because if we're going to be on in this situation of having to do a lot more virtual work for the next few months, that's a great example of how some of the other efforts that are designed to do outreach might pivot to be able to take advantage of the same kinds of approaches. Thank you.
That's right. Absolutely. And we're hoping that we're the test subjects on this, on the tech platform, but we're hoping to have something that's available for everyone to use once we work out the bugs and kinks. So really excited. And just to let you know, they're pivoting with a number of their clients across the country around community engagement. So we really have a strong subject matter expert on the term working on these pivots.
Great, thank you. I think that's it. Thank you.
Great. Any other, I don't see any other hands up at this time. I think this is an excellent start to our reconciliation list. We'll have to clean up the list a little bit. There's still some numbers we're checking. Just to remind everyone, again, we have the work session on Wednesday. There is a public hearing on the budget and the tax rate, the tax rate on Wednesday. And then we don't actually start doing votes on this until Monday. And so you can gather.
Mayor, if I might, I think one of the things that people often don't understand is that the hand votes that happen next Monday really are the key votes on the budget. What happens is the decisions are made on this reconciliation list, and then we as staff have to do quite a bit of work in preparing the actual budget documents that reflect these changes, the budget ordinances, for your action on the 13th and the 20th. So I think it's particularly useful that you are allowing not only the budget public hearings on Wednesday, but the the extra opportunity before the reconciliation list discussion next Monday for the public to weigh in.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think that's everything. If folks have other things that come up before Wednesday's meeting, please send them to the city manager and the deputy city manager to plug them into this. And we'll look forward to having more information, particularly around the staff reductions. And I just want to say thank you so much to the city staff for pulling together all the information from us. I know a lot of us just got some more this evening, but the information that was shared over the weekend was incredibly helpful, very easy to follow. I think you can see from the productive conversation we've had tonight, having the more information, really going through this is really like rolling up our sleeves and getting a lot of the work done on this budget. And so I thank my colleagues and everyone else. And as Councilmember Seaman said, you know, it looks like we all share a very common goal in moving this forward, in looking at how we can address the current crisis, how we're going to come out of the emergency in the short term, and then how are we going to look at the recovery in the long term for our community. And so we may disagree on some of the specific items on this list when we get down to it, but I know I can say with all certainty, working with my colleagues here on the council as well as with the staff, that is our overarching goal that we are working towards in this budget. And I am very honored and proud to work with each and every one of you and the staff at this time. So I just want to extend my thanks to everyone and wish you all a good evening, and we'll be back again on Wednesday evening. We're adjourned.